There are a lot of mysteries in Breath of the Wild, many of which were left unresolved after the credits rolled, like the origins of the Forgotten Temple, the giant Leviathan skeletons, the strange case of Mekar Island, and of course most famously, who were the Zonai and what happened to them. But there's one mystery in particular I've had an almost unhealthy obsession with ever since 2017, the mystery of the 8 heroines. Despite my obsession, I actually only made one video about it, because simply put, there wasn't enough information to come to a satisfying conclusion. It really seems that the Zelda team deliberately designed it such that it would be an unsolvable case. That is to say, unsolvable with just the information presented by Breath of the Wild and its complementary book Creating a Champion, which didn't explain much about them either. I even stated in my video that it would be the last time I would look into this mystery until the release of Tears of the Kingdom. And the reason I said this was because even if Tears of the Kingdom does end up giving us the answers we crave about the 8 heroines, I assumed that we would likely need to, play the actual game to find out. I didn't expect any significant clues to show up in the game's promotional material. However, some of the stuff we saw in the final trailer got my Scooby-Doo senses tingling once more. And so here we are again 6 months later, back to take one final crack at this mystery. To keep the runtime of this video somewhat manageable, I'm gonna assume that most of you know the details behind these statues by now and only stick to the ClefferNotes version. If you're not familiar, there are tons of videos out there that explain every little detail you need to know about them, including my video from 6 months ago. So in the desert in Breath of the Wild we found 7 giant statues, which by all accounts are some of the most ancient ruins found in Hyrule. The architectural style of the stonework and the inscriptions reveal that they were built by the Gerudo back in ancient times. Nobody in the current day knows who each individual statue is supposed to represent. It's a part of Gerudo history that's been lost, which is not surprising. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of years. What we do know, based on the inscriptions carved into them, is that they are memorials created in honor of a group of individuals known as the 7 Sages. On the surface, this isn't that big of a deal. There's quite a few references to sages from past games all across Breath of the Wild's Hyrule, be it names that are derivative of sages, structures that symbolize or pay tribute to them in some way, even historical texts that flat out mention some of them by name, like the Zora monuments, which directly refer to Princess Ruto from Ocarina of Time. Over the years, many have tried to connect these statues to some of the sages of old, particularly the ones from Ocarina, which, if you include Princess Zelda, amounts to 7. However, there's not a lot to work with in terms of hard evidence. Like I said, there are references to the sages of Ocarina, but then again, the same goes for sages from different games, some of which didn't show up in the Zelda timeline until way later. And that's the thing. Sages have appeared in various forms, ages, genders, races, and in different numbers all across the Zelda timeline, and their existence seems to work on the same basic principle as the many incarnations of Princess Zelda. There's almost always a blood connection involved to some degree, and when a sage awakens, as it's called, they appear to inherit knowledge and memories from past lives. You could say that sages are essentially timeless. They continue to reincarnate and take on new appearances so they can assist the Kingdom of Hyrule over the ages. As such, it's hard to say which incarnation of the 7 sages these statues pay tribute to, or which historical event they took part in. It all depends on when these statues were built, which is impossible to know for sure right now. Thanks to Creating a Champion, we know that the rocks placed around the pedestal of the Master Sword are depictions of the sages from Ocarina of Time. It's indisputable. Not only is there no Rito present, which makes sense since the Rito didn't exist yet at the time, but the smallest rock is labeled as a Kokiri, and as we all know, the Kokiri transformed into the Koroks shortly after the events of Ocarina of Time, and stay that way for the remainder of Hyrule's history. Unfortunately, this kind of inductive reasoning cannot be applied to the 7 heroines. The statues are close to identical and carry no labels that infers a name or even a race. That said, there is one important aspect about the heroines that separates them from all the other memorials and callbacks to the sages. There's a secret 8th heroine. This was a game changer because, as far as we know, there's not a single event in the original Zelda timeline where 8 sages bonded together. In A Link Between Worlds, there were 7 sages without Zelda included, but Zelda didn't play the role of a sage in that story, and so the total headcount still amounts to 7 regardless. It's always been no more than 7. The fact that an 8th, almost identical statue exists provides a solid case that the statues of the heroines do not pay tribute to any pre-established group of sages, but rather a new ensemble we haven't seen or met before. This would place the construction of the statue sometime after the original Zelda timeline, but still well before the calamity from 10,000 years ago, for a couple of reasons. First of all, and this is one I've seen a lot of confusion about, Calamity Ganon is not Ganondorf. It's a phantom Ganondorf created after he got sealed deep underground. Unable to move, he devised a new strategy so he could continue to wreak havoc on the world above. By forcing his malice to seep out from his frozen corpse, it accumulates and eventually forms into the ghostly specter we saw soaring above the peaks of Hyrule Castle. This process of building up malice is extremely slow, which is why after his calamity was successfully halted 10,000 years before Breath of the Wild, it took him, well, 10,000 years to unleash the next calamity, which of course is the event we saw in the memories. The events of the distant past depicted on the mural in Tears of the Kingdom are much older than the calamity from 10,000 years ago. In fact, it seems to coincide with an event listed in the timeline featured in Creating a Champion, where after having been defeated many times before, referring to the original Zelda timeline, Ganondorf finally lost it and transformed into Calamity Ganon. So when someone says that this mystery lady could be the princess on the tapestry, that is very unlikely. These two events took place many ages apart from each other, at least 10,000 years, and Tears of the Kingdom's focus seems to be on these events and not the ones from the tapestry, which finally brings us to the clues found in the final trailer for Tears of the Kingdom. In it we see a character who, based on his appearance, is the same individual who's depicted on the ancient mural, and the 7 orbs that surround this mystery figure we now know are the so-called Tears of the Kingdom, powerful objects that are attributed to certain individuals and are likely this game's equivalent of the main story collectible, like the medallions from Ocarina of Time. Across the footage we can see various people who are in possession of one of these tears, including our favorite Chad, Ganondorf. So far we've been able to pinpoint 6 unique tears in total, and based on the mural we can assume that there is one more. We just haven't seen it yet. Where it gets confusing is that there's a few instances where we can see the same tier being held by different individuals. And this has everything to do with the fact that, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but yes, Tears of the Kingdom most certainly features some kind of time travel. It seems that early on in the story, Zelda will be transported to the ancient past, where she joins up with a new cast of characters we haven't met before. Among them is the creature portrayed on the mural, who can be seen interacting with the princess in this sequence. Okay, so I want to be completely transparent about this. We do actually know the name of this character, but out of respect for the ones who haven't seen the leaked art book and want to keep it that way, I will not mention it here. Instead, I will shamelessly copy one of my fellow Zelda theorists, Bandit Games, and just call him Richard. Over the course of the footage, it becomes pretty obvious what's going on between these two timelines. From what we can gather, there's essentially 2 battles against Ganondorf taking place simultaneously, just in different time periods. Zelda joins the sages in the ancient past, and back in the present, a new group of sages is being recruited by Link for the fight against Ganondorf in his time. This explains why, to the left of Richard, we can see an adult Rito warrior carrying the green tear on his left foot, or talon, I should say, in the same place where Tulin wears his green tear. So basically Tulin is the present day equivalent or successor to this ancient Rito warrior. And the same will likely apply to Riju, Sidon, and probably Yunobo if and when he decides to show up. From what I understand, the conflict in the past will eventually lead to Ganondorf being sealed. In fact, when you think about it, it has to happen, or else it would create a paradox. The Ganondorf from the past cannot win, he cannot even be killed. He must be sealed. If he doesn't, then Link and Zelda would never find his sealed corpse, which also means Zelda would never travel to the past. But she is in the past, so technically it already happened. The complexities of time travel. Anyway, it's the present where the outcome is uncertain, and with the Master Sword broken and the location of some of the tears possibly lost to memory, there's very little standing in the way of a victory for Ganondorf. However, Zelda being stuck in the past presents a unique opportunity to subtly influence the outcome in Link's time. Not too drastic, of course, like I said, she cannot just kill Ganondorf in her time, but she could, for example, provide information, like where the tears are located in the present, or helping to fix the Master Sword in some way. As long as the events of the past lead to Ganondorf being sealed, it's okay. But how this will be accomplished and what Zelda's mission will be exactly is a subject for another video. In order to find out who the 8th heroine is, we need to map out who the biggest players were in the time period Zelda is in. For the sake of argument, I'm gonna assume that Link's contributions will mostly be confined to the present, so I'm leaving him out of it. This also eliminates the new sages who are being assembled by him, like Riju, Sidon, Tulin, Yunobo, and any other potential characters who join the group. That said, we can use the new sages as a reference to determine who some of the characters from the past were, because so far both Riju and Tulin have a corresponding predecessor who are of the same race or faction and are wielding the same weapons. The aforementioned Rito warrior who wields the Great Eagle's bow, and a Gerudo who appears to brandish the Scimitar of the Seven, the only scimitar we know of that has a red gem on the hilt of the sword. It is my belief that Team Richard is made up of 8 people in total, 7 sages plus Princess Zelda. 5 of these 8 members have been confirmed so far. We have Richard and Zelda, the Rito and Gerudo, and the Mystery Lady. Some believe this is Hylia or even just Zelda with a makeover, but personally I don't think that's the case. While they do share similarities, I think she is her own character. Be it a distant relative of Zelda or someone belonging to the Zonai, or both, it doesn't really matter for today's subject. All that matters for now is that I regard Zelda and this unknown lady as 2 separate individuals. I think it's a safe bet that since there's a Rito and a Gerudo among the group, there's bound to be a Goron and Zora as well. In the case of the Zora, it's pretty much a given, seeing as Sidon has one of the tiers, the blue one in this case. As for the Gorons, you may remember that a couple of years ago, the Italian voice actor for Daruk accidentally slipped up during an interview and stated that he's voicing a new Goron, in his words, a more serious ancestor of Daruk. Back then we didn't really know what to make of this since we didn't have context, but knowing what we know now, I'm starting to think that he was probably referring to the Goron sage from the ancient past. So let's run with that. This brings the current headcount of Team Richard to 7, which means we are only short 1 more member. Then we have Ganondorf, who some believe might also be a sage, since he does have a tier of his own. The sage of shadow or darkness perhaps, who could have betrayed the other 6. However, I'm not on board with that theory. It kinda goes against everything we know about the sages. As I explained earlier, sages are servants of the light and the gods. They are of a similar stature as the light spirits, the dragons, and other types of spirit guardians. Ganondorf is quite literally the polar opposite of that. He's a being of hatred, malice, and darkness. It would be quite strange if he was a vessel for one of the sages, in part because he's already kind of a vessel for demise. Not to mention, in Team Richard we already have a Gerudo sage. There are many alternatives as to why Ganondorf has one of the tiers in his possession. Maybe he stole it from one of the other factions. Maybe he's hunting for the tiers, like Thanos going after the Infinity Stones. It's not uncommon for Ganondorf to go after sacred objects, like how he tried to force the Deku Tree, the Gorons, and Zora into giving him their spiritual stones in Ocarina of Time. In Twilight Princess, Ganondorf is in possession of one of the most sacred swords out there, the Sword of the 6 Sages, which he stole from them. I'm sure you don't have to be a sage in order to use the tier's power. These are just my thoughts, of course, and I'm not bashing anyone who thinks Ganondorf could be a sage. I'm just providing alternatives based on my own interpretations of the pre-established lore. As such, it is my belief that similar to the unseen Goron sage, there is one more who has eluded us so far. A representative of one of the other factions in Hyrule perhaps. And given the history of the sages, my money is on either a Sheikah who could possess a purple shadow tier, or maybe a Korok. Though I think the Sheikah are the more likely candidate. Just bring my girl Paya into it. Come on, Nintendo. If there is indeed one more, that would bring Team Richard to 8 people. 8 sages who bonded together a long time ago in an effort to stop Ganondorf. Now you might be wondering, what about Zelda? She's in the past, so couldn't she be the 7th? How do we know there's not 6 ancient sages who teamed up with her? Well, if you look at the design of some of these characters, you might notice a pattern. Richard has 1 white tear painted onto his nose, if that is his nose. Zelda has 2, 1 under each eye. And the Mystery Lady has a grand total of 8 tears painted on her face. I don't think this is a coincidence, and if it's not, we can safely assume that the other sages will have their own unique numbers attributed to them, which is compelling evidence that the group does indeed consist of 8 people in total, without having to throw Ganondorf into the mix. So after all that, let's circle back to the mystery of the 8 heroines. It's safe to say that the statues are most likely memorials to Team Richard. Which one is which is hard to know for sure since, again, the statues are pretty much identical and nameless. An archaeologist in town does mention a list of abilities each individual is said to have possessed, but they are quite abstract to say the least, like skill, for example, whatever that means. There are a few that are more obvious, like flight being tied to the Rito, spirit to the Gerudo, knowledge may refer to Zelda, or maybe this guy given his third eye, which often symbolizes some sort of clairvoyance. Endurance may have something to do with the sturdiness of the Gorons, motion possibly refers to the power of recall, and perhaps gentleness shares a connection to a kind of healing ability like we saw with Nifa. But these are best guesses, and there's no way to know for sure until we see these ancient sages in action. So instead, let's focus solely on the 8th heroine. I'll quickly say that I am aware that there are theories out there that Ganondorf could be the 8th heroine, but instead of spending another 2 minutes on that now, I'd rather present my own conclusion first and then address the Ganondorf theory at the end, because as you may have guessed, I don't think it's him. So, out of all the individuals that make up Team Richard, which one is the 8th heroine? The easy answer would obviously be the mystery woman. After all, she wears the number 8 on her face. Not only that, but if she is a Zonai, a tribe who is said to have disappeared, then it would make sense that she's the missing 8th. Another candidate would be Richard. Out of all the characters in the group, he seems to be the one who ends up making the ultimate sacrifice and seals Ganondorf in place. He's the only one who wears a bracelet like the one we saw in the green hand latched onto Ganondorf's body. He's also huge, especially compared to Zelda. And in the 2019 footage, we saw a brief flash of Ganondorf's final moments right before his imprisonment. Now, Ganondorf is already a big guy, and yet the size of the arm that reaches out to him suggests an individual who's as big, if not bigger, than he is. This means that the image we see here is what remains of Richard after thousands of years of keeping Ganondorf pinned down. It's quite morbid, actually. And if he's been down here for millennia, with Ganondorf, someone whose existence has also been forgotten, it presents a pretty solid case that Richard could be the missing sage. But as you may have guessed, I think neither of these two are the 8th heroine, because the way I see it, the statues were likely built shortly after the battle against Ganondorf was over, to commemorate those who took part in this world-changing event. So even if either of these two die or disappear during or after the battle, then at the time they would still be fresh in everyone's memory. Surely they would have been remembered through eyewitness accounts or perhaps by their fellow sages if some of them end up surviving the battle. There has to be a more sensible reason as to why one of the 8 sages would have been wiped from history as it's been described, which is why I think that the 8th heroine is none other than Zelda. And the more you think about it, the more it starts to make sense. Out of all these people, Zelda is the only one who doesn't belong in this time period. In fact, her being there is the only reason why it was possible to have 8 sages in the same place as opposed to the traditional 7. There were essentially 2 Zeldas taking place in the same fight. They would have had every reason to treat her separately and keep her identity a secret. I think we can all agree that Link will eventually win the fight against Ganondorf in the present, right? I mean, this is Zelda we're talking about. Well, that victory was made possible by Zelda's contributions in the ancient past. From the vantage point of the people who built these statues back then, that future outcome of Ganondorf's defeat hasn't happened yet. And so, the less people know about a time-traveling princess who was there and made it all possible, the better the chances that that future remains secure. We can also assume that at some point in the story, Zelda will return to her own time, and when she does, she is quite literally wiped from history. The same way the hero of time became non-existent after Zelda sent him back in time to relive his childhood. In hindsight, the nature of the statue itself also hides many clues about its true identity. One of the key aspects that differentiates the 8th heroine statue from the other 7 is that it's a mirror opposite. What I mean by that is that for some reason, the in-game model for the statue, textures and all, has been flipped. It's a detail that has puzzled theorists ever since it was first discovered because they didn't have to do that. The statue would have fit on the side of this mountain just fine, mirrored or not mirrored, so why go through the effort of flipping the model? However, in context with the story of Tears of the Kingdom, it suddenly makes a lot of sense. All across the board, we've seen a recurring theme of mirror opposites, like 2 opposite tears, 2 dragons facing each other or devouring each other's tail, the strange reversed vocals we keep hearing in all of the footage. Back when we didn't know much about the game's story yet, we theorized that it could have something to do with the duality of Hylia and Zelda, or the endless curse of demise, or something like that. But it seems we were completely off. The theme of mirror opposites seems to refer to the connection between these 2 different time periods. And the biggest giveaway for me is the 2 opposing tiers. I believe that these represent the recall tier. All the other tiers allegedly stay in their own time period in the hands of their contemporary sages. The recall tier is different. It's the only tier who, at least for a little while, exists as a duplicate in the same time period. The one Zelda has, which originates from the present, and the one that was already in the past, which looks to be in possession of the other woman. They even carry them in the same way, on a necklace. Another possible connection between Zelda and the 8th heroine is that unlike the other statues, it doesn't have a sword in hand, and seemingly never did. The sword does exist, but it's found further up the mountain, and has been dubbed the Forgotten Sword. In some of the new footage, we see that Zelda has the Broken Master Sword with her, meaning that it was somehow sent into the past with her. If Zelda returns to her own time at some point, it's safe to say that the sword will too, and thus it'll be wiped from history along with her. So perhaps the missing sword may be a reference to that. I mean, it is literally called the Forgotten Sword. I think it would be a fitting and poetic answer to the mystery of the 8th heroine, an individual who didn't belong yet was still memorialized in secret for her contributions, and so they constructed it far away from the other 7 in a place not many people are likely to set foot in. Here it stood for thousands of years, and only those with the knowledge of the ancient past would be able to know its true meaning. If I end up being right about this, it would tie surprisingly well into my previous theory about the 8th heroine. In that video I suggest that the dragons are paying their respects to the statue, mainly because some of their flight paths seem to coincide with its location. I won't go into further detail about that here, just watch the video if you're interested, I guess. But with this new conclusion in mind that the 8th heroine is a memorial to Zelda, then I could be right about the dragons too. After all, if there's anyone who would have been alive in the time period Zelda was stuck in and still remembers her contributions in the present day, it would be them, since they are essentially immortal. There's even a theory floating around that Richard's true form is that of a dragon, which has some compelling evidence going for it. So before I wrap things up, let's quickly talk about Ganondorf being the 8th heroine. For me, this idea doesn't work very well, especially in context with the other 7 statues. The idea seems to stem from the same theory we talked about before, that he himself was a sage and may have betrayed the other 7, and that this is why his statue was secreted away. But as I said before, the statues were most likely built after the battle between the sages and Ganondorf was over. So then, why would they still choose to pay tribute to a guy who essentially tried to enact genocide on everyone? And by they, I'm of course referring to the Gerudo. The stonework of the 8th heroine has all the characteristics of Gerudo culture. They are the only ones who built statues that look like this, and continue to do so in the current day. And the Gerudo were clearly not on board with Ganondorf, unless of course the 7 and the 8th were made by different factions, maybe an offshoot of the Gerudo who were loyal to Ganondorf and managed to survive the war. But then, how do we explain this place? In the present day it serves as a hideout for the Yiga clan, but creating a champion confirms that it was originally an ancient Gerudo archaeological site. It looks like it used to be a secret shrine of some kind, seeing as it was carved inside the mountains hidden from plain sight. It features 8 statues standing in a circle, and the way I see it, there's only 2 options. Either the Gerudo who were against Ganondorf built it, which means they were well aware of the existence of the 8th sage and included them with the other 7. It wouldn't make a lot of sense if that sage was Ganondorf, their enemy. The other option is that the quote-unquote evil Gerudo constructed this place, those who were loyal to Ganondorf, which raises the question of why would they build statues to all 8 of them, including the 7 who defeated him? You would expect to see something more along the lines of a site of worship solely devoted to Ganondorf. Last but not least, despite the 8th heroine statue being a mirror opposite, the inscriptions still read 7 sages. You know, the people who defeated Ganondorf? I don't know about you, but if I ever get a statue in my honor, I sure as heck hope they don't inscribe it with my biggest enemies. But that's just me, of course. Actually, one more thing, as I was recording this, Nintendo of Japan posted a new video which actually features a shot of the 7 heroines. Or should I say 4 heroines, since 3 statues are missing. Actually 2 are missing, you can see the 5th one, but it's very hard to see without upping the contrast. For those who are curious, I posted a tweet about it featuring some mad scribbles and some very bad grammar. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with the time travel aspect, like they killed some of the sages in the past and now there's only 5 statues. Instead, the answer seems to be a lot more grounded. It looks like there's a sinkhole that formed in the center, approximately where the shrine used to be. We know sinkholes are a thing in Tears of the Kingdom. In fact, the ones you see here are at the Eastern Barrens, which is actually quite close to the 7 statues. The sinkhole seems to be dragging the statues in, slowly consuming them. So there you go. Anyway, that about does it for this one. As always, thank you so much for watching. It wasn't easy coming up with a subject because not only is there just so much to cover, but new information kept getting out as I was working on this, which was kind of frustrating. Not to mention, my fellow Zelda creators are all killing it right now, which is just so awesome to see. That said, I hope I was able to bring something to the table here. And if not, then, well, at least I tried. That is all for today, and I hope to see you all next time.